If you guys have been paying very close attention to the UFC, you will notice that they have recently signed 4 fighters from Tajikistan. Now, these are the first 4 fighters the UFC has ever signed from Tajikistan, and all of a sudden now they went from 0 to 4 fighters from Tajikistan within the space of about 6 months. And more importantly, these fighters are bringing in insane numbers for the UFC. Remember when Nurullo Aliyev made his debut and the UFC broadcast showed a stadium, or like half a stadium, full of people watching this massive big screen of Nurullo Aliyev's fight? Well, it turns out that exact same thing happened when Muhammad Naimov and Muin Gafurov fought on the same card last week. So that kind of means the UFC isn't stupid. They're going to start signing fighters from Tajikistan, but another thing that they're going to have to keep their eye on is they're not the only promotion trying to tap into this market of countries of fighters that support their fighters like nothing. Like, what other country in the world is setting up stadiums or football fields or whatever of people to sit around and watch fights of people from their country? I probably couldn't really name it many at all, and it turns out Bellator, whether or not they discovered it by accident or on purpose, is doing the same thing as well. At the moment, there are 4 fighters from the UFC from Tajikistan in the UFC. That is Nurullo Aliyev, Loic Radzhabov, Muhammadjon Naimov, Muin Gafurov, and now in Bellator there are 2 fighters, to my knowledge, that are from Tajikistan, and that is Savajan Kamidov, who's 15-0, and a fighter that UFC should just try and pick up when his Bellator contract expires, and Sharaf Devletmuradov, who UFC should probably also try and pick up. Now, in this video, I'm actually going to be talking about 16 to 17 of the best fighters from Tajikistan that the UFC, or maybe even Dana White's Contender Series, should pick up. And the reason why they should pick up these fighters is they're pulling so many numbers for the UFC. They're gathering in groups of thousands of people to watch their fighters on the big screen. That means if they sign more fighters from Tajikistan, they could put on events in Tajikistan or maybe in neighboring countries to Tajikistan and really build into that sort of area of the world, because it is obvious to me that Tajikistan fans, they love MMA, and not only do they love MMA, they love to support their own fighters from Tajikistan. So it seems pretty clear that the UFC needs to start making some big signings, and the first big signing that I believe that the UFC should try and make is Samander Muradov. He is 8-0, he's a welterweight, he's 23 years old. I talk about this guy all the time. I genuinely do believe that this guy is probably one of the best unsigned fighters in the world. I just made an individual video about this guy, and I think he should get signed to the UFC very soon. He's incredibly good. 10-0 win, 19-3, 19-4 win. This guy doesn't have a padded record over anybody. He is fighting good fighters. He is probably the best signing the UFC could make from Tajikistan right now. But aside from that, there is also a bunch of other good options. Faridan Odilov is another very good option. He's 16-2. He's a light heavyweight, or maybe he's a middleweight. But the point is, the UFC needs more middleweights and light heavyweights. They need more fighters from the higher weight classes, and Faridan Odilov will fit in pretty well. Now, he is signed to ACA, so we're probably going to have to wait for his contract to expire, but I'm sure eventually the UFC probably could get their hands on Faridan Odilov. The next one here is Khabibulo Azizov. You may see that he does have the Russian flag from his Tapology account, but it does seem like he was born in Tajikistan, so I feel like maybe he does count. I think that he probably would be a very smart signing no matter what, especially if he wins this fight here for Matrix Fight Night, which is actually an Indian regional promotion, so it's very interesting that this fight is going to be taking place there. But the winner of this fight needs to get signed. If it's Khabibulo Azizov, I think that would be perfect to kind of tap into the Tajikistani market. The next one is Azam Gafurov. I believe this guy is ready to be signed now. Very experienced, 14-3 record over pretty good competition as well. He's also signed to ACA, but he's a flyweight. The UFC needs flyweights. He's only on a 2-fight win streak, but he's fought a couple of good guys, and Azamat Pushukov is a pretty well-known regional fighter at this point. So I think Gafurov is probably a good signing. This next one here, this is for Dana White's Contender Series. As I said, the UFC needs more light heavyweights, and Osmanbek Kakanayev is from Tajikistan. He's 5-0, and he's just kind of demolished everyone he's fought. He hasn't really fought the best level of competition, but in his debut, he finished a guy that was 3-0 in the second round, and then he fought a guy that only had one fight, but then he's beaten 5-2, 6-2, and 2-0 opponents within 2 rounds. If this guy makes it on to Dana White's Contender Series, I better be credited with this pick, right? Like, come on, UFC. If you want to beat Bellator, if you want to beat PFL, if you want to beat whoever that is trying to get their hands on these fighters from Tajikistan, hit me up. Like, come on, like, I've got a business email. Like, I'd love to work for the UFC as a scout, and like, this video is kind of like me like really researching one specific country. And with that being said, I'm actually thinking about doing that for more fighters. I'm thinking about doing it for China as well, because the UFC is trying to obviously get into the Chinese market with the UFC Performance Institute in Shanghai. So if you want me to make a similar video for different countries around the world, let me know, and I'll definitely do my research into them. The next one here is Jahongir Saidyammolov. I'm so sorry I said his name incorrectly there, but he's a welterweight, I believe, or maybe he's a lightweight. He did recently lose to Kachinbek Adeslam Ulu, who is a great fighter in his own right, 20-3, and recently won a big fight over Kamil Magomedov at Brave. This guy is also a guy that UFC should pick up, but he was born in Kazakhstan, not Tajikistan, so he's not in the video for that reason. But Jahongir, I mean, very experienced, 16-5. Maybe you could put him on Contender Series to maybe get him on a 2-fight win streak, because he hasn't won since the start of last year, and he's also only on a 1-fight win streak right now. So maybe you could put him on Contender Series, but I think he would also be a pretty smart signing by the UFC. The next one is Azumkov Rakhmonov. I think he would also be a good signing for the UFC. He's a flyweight. The UFC needs flyweights. He's on a win streak right now, and he's not only just on a normal win streak. He's on a win streak over very good fighters. You know, like he's on a 4-fight win streak over 6-1, 4-0, 5-2, and 28-14 fighters. He does have a loss to Kilun. Now, if you don't recognize that name Kilun, the UFC is very familiar with Kilun, because Kilun has actually fought on Road to UFC and also on Dana White's Contender Series, and he probably is somebody that you could potentially see in the future, because the UFC, this guy's on the UFC's radar, so you could maybe see Kilun in the future. But Ozymkam Rakhmonov on a win streak right now very much could be a Dana White's Contender Series addition. Having Tajikistan fighters on Dana White's Contender Series, I think, would be a smart idea as well, because it would kind of introduce that Tajikistan fan base that may not know what Dana White's Contender Series is to the Contender Series. I think it would just kind of like make sense. The next one is Kafiz Sakikbekov. He is 6-1. He is a featherweight. He does have a loss early on in his career, but he's on a 3-fight win streak now. Probably a guy which you might want to wait for him to develop, or maybe a Dana White's Contender Series edition, potentially a fighter that you could put on the Contender Series. Oyatulo Muminov, he's probably a little bit low on the list for how good I think this guy actually is. He's only 22 years old, so he's definitely going to develop, but he did recently just get by a 6-4 opponent, but he has kind of dominated every fighter that he's beaten. He's got a lot of finishes, a lot of first-round finishes, but every time he's kind of stepped up in competition, he has lost. Like, he lost to a 2-0 opponent, and then he took on a 10-4 opponent and a 5-1 opponent, and he did lose to them. So now it seems like he's kind of rebuilding against opponents that he can potentially get by, and now he's probably due a step up in competition. He could be due a Dana White's Contender Series appearance, you know, because if he can win on the Contender Series, then we know that he probably is pretty legit for only 22 years old. He's a flyweight. The UFC needs flyweights, and the UFC wants fighters from Tajikistan, because this is a market they definitely could break into. The next one is Mubariz Umarov. He is 10-1. He is I believe he's a featherweight or a bantamweight. He did recently lose in this custom rules bout thing, but I did look into it. I'm not too sure if this is true, but I think this Nashidalo event was like a boxing event, but in an octagon. So I don't know how much that really means to like losing in MMA, but he's on a win streak in MMA. He's on a win streak when it counts to his record. And yeah, I think maybe Mubariz Umarov, Dana White's Contender Series, just wait on him to develop before signing him sort of situation. Masoud Zamanov. This is a flyweight. The UFC needs flyweights. He does have a couple of interesting losses recently, but he's recently bounced back with a very good win over Kasan Busulatanov, who was 8-1 at the time. Probably a guy for the contender. Probably a guy you could wait on. He's only 25 years old. And then from here on out, it's kind of guys depending or just prospects to keep your eye out in the future. This guy is Amirali Sayedusharov. He actually has a massive fight coming up against Lewis McGrillen-Evans for PFL Europe 2. Now, Lewis McGrillen-Evans is like a future star, especially if he can get signed to the UFC. I mean, the MMA guru loves this guy. He made a whole video about him. He hasn't really fought anyone good, but he does possess like a weird sort of power at flyweight, and he is a guy the UFC should try and sign, because it seems like PFL have already tried to at least get their greasy little mitts on him. But the thing is, though, if Amirali Sayedusharov beats Lewis McGrillen-Evans, UFC could probably just pick him up. You know what I mean? They could pick up Sayedusharov because he could potentially be a UFC level fighter if he gets by McGrillen-Evans. So who really knows what's going on there? This one is Hassan Azizov, who is 5-1. He's also a flyweight. This is a guy you're probably going to have to wait on. As I said, these next fighters are just guys to keep your eye out in the future. Maybe in a few years, you'll see them in the UFC, like Azeksan Kushanbiev. Here, he's 24 years old, but he did lose recently. It's probably another guy we're going to have to wait on. And unfortunately for him as well, it kind of is a situation where every time he's moved up in competition, he stepped up in competition, he has lost. Like, he lost to a 5-0 opponent, and then he recently stepped up in competition again against a 12-6 opponent. So it almost seems like Aziz Khan, he's definitely developing, he's definitely getting better, he's building on his record, but he's a guy you're going to have to just give a little bit of time. Faruk Kolikov is another guy I've got on the record. He is 4-0, but he hasn't really fought anyone all like that great. So he's definitely a guy that you're going to have to wait on as well. Umid Akhmedov, another guy you're going to have to wait on, 6-2 is his record. He has fought some good guys, 3-1 and 6-0. But yeah, just hasn't got quite past that level of competition yet. So another guy you'll wait on, and then the next one that we'll wait on is Saymun Madayev, who actually was on a 5-fight win streak, but he did lose very recently. And he's probably just another guy. You give him some time, he will develop, and we can maybe see him in the UFC in a few years' time. Like, I believe he's a pretty young guy himself. So let me know what you think about that video. Let me know if you want me to maybe do videos like about other fighters. Like, maybe I could look into fighters that are free agents in Japan. Maybe I could look into fighters that are free agents in like China, for example. Free agents in Australia, the best fighters from Australia. That could be a pretty good video I just come up with. South Africa as well. There's so many options, you know, that I could potentially look into and find the best fighters from that country. But I thought I would make one about Tajikistan, because it is such a very interesting phenomenon that fighters from this country are drawing so many numbers as well. Like, when I remember Nurali Aliyev's like post-fight speech on YouTube, it got like a ridiculous amount of views. Like, it was crazy how much support these guys are getting from people in Tajikistan. So the UFC needs to recognize this trend and pick these guys up, pick some of these fighters up. And if they, hey, UFC, if you're out there and you watch this video and you're like, man, this Artin MMA guy is like, he kind of like noticed a pretty good trend here. Maybe we should listen to him. Maybe just hit me up. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not unemployed, but I could be employed by the UFC if they wanted to call a brother. I'll leave you guys there. Thank you guys once again so much for 4,000 subscribers. I really do appreciate it. And if you made it this far in the video, which I highly doubt you did, please leave a comment on the video. I would appreciate it. And please like the video if you haven't. And please do subscribe if you haven't already as well. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video, which I think actually, just to kind of give a little bit of a preview, I'm not guaranteeing you this, but it is a video idea I've got. I might just talk about this website Tapology, just in general, because that is such a good website, man. But with that being said, I will see you guys in the next one.